So I'm going to start by saying good afternoon to you all. We appreciate you finding a moment in your very busy schedules to join us for today's session on the new group reading test. My name's Emma Dibden. I'm one of a number of education advisors at GL Assessment, each with a remit of supporting schools for the best use of the data that's derived from our range of tests and surveys. I've taught for over 20 years, both in UK and international context, most recently as a SENCO and leader of inclusion. And I've had the privilege of using many of the GL assessments myself within that context. And I hope, therefore, I'm going to be well placed to support you today in understanding how the adaptive new group reading test can be used to support data-driven decisions about reading in your settings. On the call with me today, although you can't see them, is the lovely Simon and Steph, who are going to be available to help you throughout the session via the Q&A function. If you experience any issues with visuals or sound, or got comments or questions to raise, please do feel free to contact us via that Q&A function, and I'll do my very best to answer any of those questions at the end of the session, but we will ensure that we answer any that we don't have time to cover today via email. So I'm going to stop my video and hopefully talk you through the new group reading test. So whilst facing a second extended period of remote learning has created new challenges, we are aware that many of your schools have found innovative approaches to curriculum and assessments that schools across the UK are adopting. Upon return to school in September, for example, Becky Hawes, Head of Services at Cadmus Inclusive, identified that in terms of reading rate, accuracy and comprehension, there'd been a spectrum of losses and gains. And as they became reacquainted with pupils' reading skills, staff at Cadmus set up an early alert system to identify and respond to changing learning trajectories. Becky suggests that the use of the new group reading test provided support in gathering evidence about where their children were and where they needed to go next. She describes NGRT as a useful triage tool to identify who may need extra support by interrogating the whole picture of a pupil as a reader. So today I'll begin with a brief context as to the importance now more than ever of understanding students' levels of reading acquisition, after which I'll provide a quick overview of how the NGRT reading assessment works, before sharing some examples of how the key information that comes from those reports and how that data can be best used to inform teaching and learning. So using my own experience as well as examples of how teachers and schools across the country make use of their data, I hope to be able to illustrate the power of having such standardised and reliable information to impact your students' outcomes. It goes without saying that reading is perhaps the most important prerequisite skill for learning, even for subjects that are not typically tied to language. With research across many countries showing that the best predictor of future education achievement and life success is a child's reading ability in primary school. It's unsurprising, therefore, the level of attention that it's given in terms of provision and intervention that's used to support students who may experience barriers to their reading. Our new group reading test is a fully adaptive, standardised, termly reading assessment. Its adaptive nature means a personalised experience for each pupil, ensuring that it's both accessible to those who may find reading more difficult and challenging for those who need to be stretched. The test has 3 sections. Each child sitting NGRT begins with the sentence completion section at an age-appropriate level. And depending on their performance in this part of the test, they'll progress on to either a passage comprehension section or to tasks relating to phonics. Everyone completes only 2 sections, and as a student progresses through the test, their test experience should be consistent with their ability in each of the skills measured. Let's quickly look at an example taken from the new group reading test form A, and this is the digital version. What you can see on screen is a practice sentence completion question. You'll note that the instructions are really simple. The student listens to those instructions on the headphone and they click their answer choice. Here's an example of a passage comprehension practice question. Students will read the passage on the left and then answer the questions on the right. Again, full audio instructions delivered to each student, and they'll be able to refer to the accompanying text, which is displayed alongside the written question. Whilst it may at times be necessary for a student to scroll through longer passages of text on screen, we have worked hard to ensure that our standardisation process and therefore your students' results are not impacted by this. Indeed, assessment providers globally have seen no difference between scrolling on screen and switching between screens where students respond to such reading comprehension activities. Finally, we can see here a practice phonics question. The word is read out to the student, who must then determine the letter that's missing from the text. Whilst it will largely be a younger pupil who encounters the phonic element of the test, the adaptive nature of NGRT does mean that even the older students who may be required to complete questions such as this, if it's appropriate to their aptitude in reading. So how does student performance in the test translate into the information available within the reports? As with many of our reports, you'll receive an analysis of students' performance in the reading test at a number of levels. Our group reading report for teachers will support you in quickly getting to grips with the cohort or class as a whole, enabling you to evaluate broad levels of attainment in reading and identify common areas for planned support. Group level analysis will allow for a look at gender difference, for example, and then having the data in Excel format can also mean that you can manipulate your test results to consider other demographics specific to your setting. Individual student reports for teachers will help you to dig deeper into each child's test performance to establish their respective strengths and challenges. At this point in the year, you may typically be considering a second window for NGRT testing, given that the assessments can be administered termly. Our progress report would allow you then to consider whether an individual student's progress between testing periods is consistent with their prior attainment and in comparison with other pupils of the same age, making it a useful tool to support decisions regarding the implementation of interventions and perhaps for monitoring their impact. And then for schools who may be using the NGRT and CAT4, which is our cognitive ability test, our combination reports can be used to give further insight into how outcomes in the NGRT attainment test compare with underlying verbal ability. So, upon generating a group report for teachers, I would advocate looking towards the back of the report for headline information relating to the whole cohort. Knowing how students have fared collectively may give rise to important questions about the quality and levels of text that would be most appropriate to use with these young people. An analysis by gender will automatically be included in your PDF reports. The performance of other demographic groups that you might wish to investigate can be explored by running the Excel report. So, as we begin to dig a little deeper, the group report for teachers can be used for all top-level data, whether that be a whole year group, a class, or an identified group of individuals. Standard age scores are reported for each student on a scale of 69 to 141. The SAS is based on the student's raw score, which has been adjusted according to their chronological age for a comparison with a nationally representative sample of students across the UK. The group report for teachers can be used for all top-level data. And so as we look at the standard age scores, we can see that the average range is between 89 and 111, which is represented here by the yellow band. The SAS is the fairest way to compare the performance of different students within a year group or across year groups. So I strongly recommend using the SAS for your analysis. These standard age scores convert to overall stay-nines and a national percentile rank, making it easier to establish where each individual pupil's attainment sits against others of their age. Stay-nines cover a scale of 1 to 9, effectively categorising student performance within a particular band. National percentile rank will contextualise student performance with respect to the national sample. For those of you that appreciate reading age representations, these are also given for each individual, with upper and lower bands consistent with a 90% confidence interval, as well as indicators of future performance in statutory tests. We're able to define the average performance of a student at different ages according to how our standardisation sample performed in the new group reading test. In this simplified example, a 12-year-old gets a test score of 70. This places them in the bottom 10% of 12-year-olds in the national sample. Tracking across, we can see that this is the same as the average for a 9-year-old from the national sample. This 12-year-old is therefore given a reading age of 9. Reading ages are often the source of some interesting conversations. In a recent article in the TES, Dr. Jessica Ricketts, Director of Language and Reading Acquisition Research Lab at the Royal Holloway University of London, describes the complexity of reading ages, noting that they rest on the idea that there's a clear expectation for how well a child should be reading at any given age. In the interest of fairness, Dr. Ricketts suggests that rather than view them as one level of reading, they're better to be considered at an expected range. Reading develops at different rates as we age, so there are larger differences in reading age at the bottom end of the scale. And for this reason, we'd recommend the use of SAS to compare performance of groups, or to compare pupils' performance over time, as the SAS is on an equal scale. Our indicators of future test performance will be based on students' ages and may include Key Stage 2 scaled scores that reflect the results of a Key Stage 2 SATs testing and run from 80 to 120, or indicators of potential performance at GCSE in English language, which would be reported to you in the form of a decimal and related to the 1 to 9 grading system. An indicative grade, for example, of 5.2 would be reflective of a student with a high chance of attaining at grade 5, whilst also likely to attain a grade 4, according to his or her performance in this test. Whilst an indicator of 5.7 would be reflective of someone whose test performance suggests that a grade 6 could well be a possibility. A group report can also provide a great place as you begin to consider the needs of individual pupils. If I draw your attention to the final column here, you'll note the stain lines representing performance within the sentence completion, or SC, and the passage comprehension, or PC, elements of the test. These may give rise to some interesting questions. The numbers you see here are stain lines or standard 9s, and it would be fair to say that we would broadly expect there to be a rough agreement between these two values. Any students who progress onto the phonics section of the test, rather than responding to questions about the whole passage, like this student here, will not be given a passage comprehension score and may first need more specialised intervention to help with developing their basic language or decoding skills. Any student with a discrepancy of 2 or more between stain lines for sentence completion and passage comprehension will be highlighted for you. This may warrant further investigation. Alongside the other data, when generating the individual student report for teachers, you'll see some of the following information. Firstly, a profile summary, which explains what the pupil performance on the test tells us about their current ability. You can also consider this table, which provides an analysis of how the individual student performed on the different question types within the reading comprehension part of the test. This shows that of the 27 questions in the test, 9 of these were on inference and deduction, and that the pupil appeared to struggle with this section as they answered only 3 out of the 9 correctly. The number of questions posed will, of course, vary where the assessment is adaptive and responds to the perceived need for challenge or questions at a more basic level. Success with these questions is reported, ensuring that this information is carefully investigated and disseminated could lead to more effective strategic, personalised planning decisions and curriculum adaptations. For students whose testing pathway took them to the phonics related tasks, you'll be able to view a breakdown of their performance across 4 aspects as they are listed here. This may help you to identify specific areas for development as you help them to become successful readers. An implications for teaching and learning section will suggest specific strategies that can be used to support the student with reading skills identified as priorities for development. In this case, our NGRT report suggests what may be effective in tackling Alice's perceived challenges in using skills of inference and deduction. So what can you do next to help students with especially low or inconsistent scores on NGRT? Alongside SEN experts, we developed this diagnostic pathway to help with further investigations into those pupils who may be identified as struggling from their NGRT results and to try and establish a potential root issue. Assessment data has, of course, most value when it's used to inform our practice. So how can the data that we have help us to maximise impact? In his case study, Nigel Ward, Chief Executive Officer of the Northern Schools Trust, explained why schools need to assess both decoding and comprehension, and why a robust intervention programme is just as important as a robust assessment programme. Northern Schools Trust operate in a challenging social context, with over half of their Year 11 students eligible for pupil premium funding. Despite this, their schools achieve good results for their students. One of the 3 schools within the trust, the North Liverpool Academy, have been using the NGRT for several years to baseline students as they enter Year 7. They appreciate the efficiency and accessibility of the test as it adapts to the students' reading ability. As part of his reflections, Nigel notes the critical importance of getting students engaged in reading well-matched text as soon as they've taken the NGRT. At the North Liverpool Academy, NGRT is administered every September and retested again in the spring term to monitor the impact of their interventions. The school are keen to establish whether students are more confident with using new words, find out how their comprehension is developing, and also what it is about their reading that needs further work. You can click on the logo in this slide to access Nigel's case study in more detail. Conducting assessments of this nature is usually done to add to the information we already hold about each student, and I hope that I've been able to show you how using the NGRT as a standalone assessment or in combination with other tests can give rise to such useful information for your school or setting. But what do we advocate as next steps? Well, perhaps of most immediate concern in the current circumstances is the contextual value that such information may offer when making decisions for remote learning. Understanding how to adapt and refine your resources to ensure that all learners are confidently able to use and understand text will likely lead to an increased engagement and subsequent success in their learning. It will be worth further investigating the reading profiles of anyone with a score that falls in the bottom 20% or so of your students who are completing the test. That is to say, an SAS score of 85 or lower. Learning more about reading accuracy, rate, and levels of comprehension, for example, would be important in order to provide support at appropriate levels for these students' reading abilities. And a reminder that our diagnostic reading pathway outlines the ways that YARC, which is the York Assessment of Reading Comprehension, or other tests associated with the acquisition of specific literacy skills will help you to investigate those areas further. By interrogating layers of data-rich evidence, your schools can begin to identify individual students who may be resistant to interventions and those with specific learning difficulties that might require further investigation by a SENCO or member of an inclusion team. Whether there are a few or many students that fall into this category of low reading attainment, used in the context of your school, cohort and available provision will allow you to determine the thresholds you may wish to apply in identifying next steps. For some, it may be students whose test performance place them in stay 9s 1 to 3 who are given specific support, where other settings may find that the profile of their children and availability of additional support means that these thresholds are quite different. We touched upon the differential between sentence completion and passage comprehension stanines. Where there exist large discrepancies in these stanine scores, we would recommend screening for barriers which may be associated with dyslexia or other language-related challenges. Let's look at a case study example. Sam was a student who sat NGRT as a part of the school's routine baselining. The results show that she attained a low overall score, as well as potential issues with comprehension, evidenced by her stanine score on the passage comprehension section. The school then used the YARC one-to-one with Sam to further investigate her profile, and they found that there were difficulties with her fluency, which impacted her reading rate, and this was hindering in turn Sam's ability to take meaning from the text. Armed with this information, the school put into place two specific support strategies. The first was a paired reading program, which helped Sam to develop her fluency and to practice strategies for establishing a greater understanding of text. And the second was the pre-teaching of key vocabularies and themes, such that Sam would be familiar with those come lesson times and more able to access the contents of the lesson rather than expending her mental energy trying to grasp the linguistic basics. Finally, for our schools that have used the new group reading test in previous terms, or for those making use of the cognitive ability tests, it's possible to combine data across multiple assessments. NGRT can be used termly to support planning, to track progress, and to measure the impact of any interventions resulting from initial testing and other assessments that you may have made about your pupils. As yet, we are unclear as to the true impact that lockdown will have on long-term reading attainment, and this context should always be considered now when analysing progress in data over the coming months. But looking forwards, the NGRT progress report can highlight whether students' performance in successive administrations of NGRT is consistent with other students of similar starting points, or indeed if a second or third test scores are higher or lower than the majority of students of the same prior attainment. Our progress categories summarise this. If you use our cognitive ability test, the CAT4, you'll also be able to compare attainment in NGRT with underlying ability as measured by the verbal reasoning battery test by way of our combination report. Similar to the progress categories we've just seen within the report, a reading discrepancy category highlights whether an individual's test performance matches, exceeds, or is not consistent with the reading attainment of children of a similar age and cognitive profile. More so than ever, following the disruptions of last year and this, such combination reporting will likely to help you to better understand where students are experiencing barriers that may limit success. Children make progress at different rates, of course, but potentially limited progress illustrated through scores in successive administrations of NGRT would be worth looking into, as would those discrepancies between underlying verbal ability and reading attainment. As a SENCO, I always found these indicators of possible underperformance useful when identifying potential profiles of need and making decisions about which children might benefit most from additional interventions or enrichment. Using the example on screen now, despite their lower attainment scores in this test, both Tom and Nick largely performed as could be expected of them. More success may have been had by providing additional challenges for Joshua and Louisa, even though their reading attainment would appear to be marginally higher than the two boys at the top and bottom of the list. As part of our commitment to supporting our schools to move teaching and learning forward in as informed a way as possible, we recognise that the attainment of children in the UK will undoubtedly have been impacted by multiple national lockdown and the resulting closures of your schools. Some people, particularly those most vulnerable, may be impacted significantly. To help us to better understand this, our statisticians have analysed attainment data from tests completed during the first half of autumn term and made comparisons to like-for-like data from summer terms in 2018 and 2019. A full presentation of these results will be provided at 9 AM and 3:30 on Thursday, the 4th of February. But in regard to reading, preliminary analysis of NGRT scores indicate only a slight difference, suggesting that this area of learning may have been protected in some capacity during periods of remote learning. I hope that you now feel that you have an enhanced understanding of how the new group reading test can support you. Working with so many schools, we hear countless examples of how teachers can make informed data-driven decisions about curriculum content, school-wide initiatives, and individual provision using what we know to be a reliable measure of student attainment. Now, you will just receive an email inviting you to complete 2 very short survey questions. If you're able to send that, your immediate feedback would be really appreciative, as it's so important to help us in supporting the ways that we're helping schools at the moment. Before I share a final slide with some further support and advice guidance, I wonder if we have any questions, Simon.
There's no more on there at the moment, Emma.
Okay.
I think you've been sent some through.
Yes,
I've answered a couple, but yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I've got a question here that asks how often students should sit the NGRT. We recommend administering the NGRT digital 3 times a year, once in each term, because that's going to allow for the most effective monitoring of reading progress. We would suggest, however, that if you do use NGRT 3 times in a year, that you use Form A in the first term, Form B in the second, and Form C in the third, because that's going to help it make your data analysis much easier for you and avoid any confusion, and is particularly helpful for comparisons across maths or school groups. We wouldn't recommend you using NGRT more than 3 times a year. However, you could use it once or twice, and again, we'd try and suggest you start with Form A and then Form B. There's another question here about using further assessment action for students who don't appear to be making anticipated progress between NGRT testing windows, or those who may be experiencing specific barriers to reading. Well, the context for those decisions are going to look very different setting to setting, but a progress report can be a really helpful place to start. The report can offer an early flag for students who might be experiencing barriers to progress in reading, and then cross-referencing that information with their individual report can help you to identify any specific skills difficulties across the 3 elements of the test. That's the sentence completion, passage comprehension, and their phonic knowledge. And then by scrutinising those layers, you ought to be able to establish particular areas of challenge. And I remind you of the reading diagnostic pathway, which can then be used to establish the most appropriate screeners that you could use to further investigate any gaps in students' acquired literacy skills. So if I think of an example, if a pupil experienced challenges so that they pursued the phonic task path within NGRT, and then those results appeared inconsistent across those 4 phonic aspects that are tested, it might be possible that you'd want to consider using something like the phonological assessment battery, or the FAB, to explore a detailed picture of the student's knowledge and skills in that area. That particular test is also appropriate for EAL students. Of course, that's only one pathway that you might follow. Your decisions will be personalised in response to the individual picture of data that you have available. But do reach out and contact us if you need any more advice in that regard. And I think that's it for questions. But I'll just finish then and hope that you feel as though you're taking away an enhanced understanding of how the new group reading test can help you. We've seen so many schools and heard countless examples of how they are engaging and using this data. So hopefully what I've signposted here are going to be useful resources that can help you to get the most from your new group reading test. Each of the resources here are hyperlinked for your convenience. Please do get in touch about arranging a training session or a one-to-one data consultation if you'd like to. And should you use any other GL assessments, why not consider joining one of my colleagues on another one of our webinars across the coming days, which is going to continue at the same time tomorrow as we look at our progress test series. That's it from me. Thank you.